Nick Edgar is an emotional agility and self-leadership coach, but he's so much more than that. Nick is one of the most incredible people I've ever met. He's proactively helping to shatter stigmas about mental well-being and advocating positive practices that enhance the way we feel and live. In this conversation, we explore Nick's life, from how he grew up, the surroundings he came from, which were far from progressive when it comes to emotional and mental well-being, the challenges that he faced as a young man, especially around his inner critical voice and self-worth, but then how he overcame those challenges and explored himself that has helped him to realise a passion he has and is now actively practicing every day. So welcome to the Can I Be Open podcast with me, James Thacker, and my guest, Nick Edgar. I really hope you enjoy this conversation. Nick, good to see you, mate. And thank you very much for joining me on one of the very first episodes of this new podcast, new journey that I'm going on. For those that don't know you, and from what I've just said in the blurb, as we mentioned, could you just tell us a little bit more about yourself and what it is that you're doing?
Well, first of all, James, thank you for inviting me on this new venture of yours. I'm really excited and privileged and proud that you asked me to come on here. I've known you for just over a year now, in a variety of different settings. So I love appearing on podcasts and just having conversations, open and vulnerably. So I wanted to start with that. I would describe myself as a self-leadership and emotional agility coach. So what does that mean? Well, I take a person-centered approach, which means I treat everybody that I work with on a one-to-one basis on their own terms, individually. And I believe that coaching has a real power in terms of helping people to find their own answers and solutions for things that are happening in the now, and to help them with a forward-thinking view of who and where they want to be moving forwards. So that's the kind of, I think when we allow ourselves the privilege to be the leader of our own life, that's really when we truly step into our own power. But I think in order to do that, we have to recognize that we are emotional beings. We're imperfect. We make mistakes. We're often full of contradictions. And that can be hard to navigate, especially when we're under pressure or stress. So emotional agility for me is being able to develop a self-awareness that allows you to ride the waves of life. That's it in a nutshell.
Absolutely. No, and I can speak from experience, having worked with you as well, and I recognise how important that is. One thing that I think a lot of people listening would be curious about is that around this topic of self-leadership and coaching, there's maybe two avenues that you could have gone down to address some of the things that, as people, the challenges that we go through, and the traditional route of therapy, which a lot of people will be maybe more familiar with just due to the kind of way that we prioritize how emotional well-being is catered for from a societal point of view, and maybe on the coaching side it's maybe something that is still emerging as a track to walk down. I'm interested as to why you chose the coaching route as opposed to the therapist route. Was there something that resonated more with you from a coaching standpoint? And I guess let's kind of explore that.
Yeah, look, that's a great question. And I'm someone that's personally benefited from probably collectively 5 years or so and well over 250 sessions of what you might describe as traditional kind of talking therapies. So whether it's CBT, whether it's person-centered, more integrative, I've had some Gestalt therapy. And I needed those experiences because I didn't really have the grounding that, as I look back now, I'd have probably benefited from, which I know we could dip into later on in the conversation. So I actually, when I decided that I wanted to really follow more of a heart-led path in terms of my career, I'd worked 20 years in 3 different industries in a variety of different, more corporate roles. Therapy was the first thing I thought of doing. I did my level 2 counselling concepts. I did a counselling skills level 3 equivalent at the Sherwood Psychotherapy Institute in Nottingham. And I had a place to then take the kind of final level 4, level 5 steps and qualify as a counsellor and psychotherapist. But something inside me just didn't quite feel aligned about doing that in terms of how I wanted to be of service. And by then, because of the work I've been doing on myself, I recognized and had developed enough self awareness to know when something wasn't quite feeling right inside me and against the choices I was making. And it was at that point I really opened myself up to coaching. There's a saying that at some stage, rather than kind of helping people out of the water, it can be useful to kind of work out why they're falling in the first place. So I think my self awareness about who I am, my energy levels, being a highly sensitive man, I started to tune into that feeling, but think about where could I best place myself to have the greatest impact, which would light me up and hopefully be able to support people in the way that they deserve to be supported. And it just felt like coaching for me was where I was better placed than more traditional therapy. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think something you mentioned in there as to how you came to that decision was a feeling,
Mm.
and something that um, you instinctually were being pulled towards the route of coaching, rather than a different path. If you can remember and maybe lean into that experience, a lot of people, especially young people in my age demographic and lower, who are trying to carve their own path in the world and who are looking to set sail on their own adventure and journey with a career or a profession or a passion that they have, will often, I think, be really stuck in terms of how do I make that decision and around how to choose which path to go. And I'm a big advocate for following the heart, following things that you're truly passionate about, because at the end of the day, there's a reason why your heart's telling you that that's way to go. It's because it's something that you can feel that you're passionate about and you're motivated towards that feeling. So, can you maybe describe that feeling that you were getting that was pulling you towards that, and then maybe how you kind of rationalize that feeling to a point where you were like, okay, I'm confident that I'm making the right decision?
Yeah, I think the best way I can answer that, James, is to start with sort of. I think we're a very cognitively led society, and all of us in the UK, to greater or lesser extent, follow a similar path of upbringing, school, and then being encouraged to think about what it is that we want to do for a career. And it's often done and presented to us in quite a logical way. Now, don't get me wrong, I think that's important. Learning to think critically, learning to kind of tune in to what lights us up from the brain, it can really serve us. But I think if you're called to move in a different direction, or maybe you as a human being don't quite fit into um, walking that path as easily as some others, you might find yourself making cognitively led decisions that just don't feel right. And somewhere inside you, you know that that's the case. But nevertheless, because everyone else is walking this path seemingly quite comfortably or in a more self-assured manner, you kind of ignore it or you push that down. And I did that a lot as a younger man. So I think for me, when I hit my 40s, I just decided that having gone on the journey that I'd gone on, I needed to really learn how to get back in tune with that intuition, to really understand what are the signals my body's giving me that might be able to support me. So for me, it was going on a kind of journey of more somatic practices. And by that, I mean in the body, and opening myself up to more holistic therapies, practices. Some of the most common ones that people will no doubt know will be things like meditation, which again can drum up images of kind of sitting cross-legged, in a mountain somewhere, but it doesn't have to be that. It's quite the opposite. It's really just learning to sit with yourself and understand yourself on every level. So what I realized was that when it comes to matters of the heart for me, um, and decisions I have to make, in addition to what my brain's telling me, when I tune into a warm glow somewhere between my kind of heart and my gut that I feel a genuine sense of excitement and alignment. When things aren't quite right or a bit off, I feel myself in my heart and a kind of a throbbing and more of a kind of pulsating anxiety feeling and a kind of feeling of dread that sits lower in my gut. So for me, that's just one example of kind of how I've learned to kind of tune into what my body's telling me when it comes to decision making.
Sure. And I think one of the lessons that we can maybe take from that is how important it is to be in tune with your body and to really learn how to listen to it. And I guess you're very kind of vocal about those practices and how much you believe in them. What would you say is one of the easiest routes to kind of getting to know your body? If someone is completely alien to that topic or subject, someone is listening to this podcast who a lot of these concepts and theories are going to be completely alien to, and it's not necessarily something that they've thought about before. What would be kind of the first step to go about getting to know your body and then therefore unlocking knowing yourself?
Yeah, look, I really hear you. It's a great question. And by the way, for a good 20 years as a man, I would have been that person listening to this, feeling like all of that stuff is so far away from where I am. I'm going to have to journey to get to where it's being presented to me to even begin to get benefits from it. And that journey just felt too long, which is why I didn't embrace it for so long. So I want to start answering that question by talking about accessibility. I think all of this stuff is immediately accessible, whether you are coming to this for the first time, or whether you've had some experience and maybe thought this isn't for me, or whether you're like, yeah, I'm here for it. Wherever you are, it's accessible to you. The first thing I would do is to say, literally, to find a space where you can actually be with yourself, and by that, I always start with the breath. And it's literally a case of finding a place of quiet. Doesn't have to be, you know, anywhere kind of exotic or out in nature. It could be at your desk at work. But just to close your eyes, if you feel comfortable to do that, and just ask yourself, where am I breathing right now? Where am I breathing into? Am I breathing into the top of my chest? And it's quite quick. Am I breathing into the base of my belly? Just ask yourself some curious questions about how is my body functioning, and our respiratory system is a good way to start to develop that self awareness.
Definitely, I think it's something that we can all relate to as other human beings, where we've felt that as a common experience. You know, whether you're up in your breathing or that anxiety that you feel when you're worried about something. I think for me, the challenge at times can be vocalizing that and finding the right words to describe that feeling. But I really feel like until you maybe do the work and actually really get to know yourself, which is definitely something that I've been working on doing over the last 12 months, is really actually getting to know what is my body trying to tell me.
Mm.
And that's not a quick process at all. And we've been working together on that. It's something that you have to repeat over and over again, whether that be through journaling practices, whether that be just sitting with yourself, like you're saying, and just really trying to understand and ask yourself curious questions. I think curiosity, especially when it comes to ourselves, is a massively important thing. I think as men, but as people in general, that we don't actually allow ourselves to have internal monologue. I think we kind of
Mm.
just expect our bodies to perform and behave exactly as we want them to without any kind of self-checking. And unless there is that kind of conscious, okay, how am I really feeling right now? Then I feel like, when it comes to understanding yourself and why you're experiencing things in a certain way, then you're going to have a missing piece of the puzzle to a certain degree. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would. And going back to that theme of being in our heads a lot in society, like the first thing I would do when I notice where I breathe is to go straight into my head and try and make sense of it logically so that I can find a solution. As men kind of, without wanting to generalize too much, we can be quite solution focused, and we understand our experience when we can make sense of it with our brains and our thinking minds. But this is more about being able to work with the experience of what our body is telling us rather than trying to logically make sense of it. So if I'm feeling anxiety, rather than thinking, well, I'm feeling anxious because I've got a big thing on at work, or I've got an issue with a mate, or I'm getting married, whatever it might be, like trying to make sense of it to relieve the anxiety from our brain will only take us so far, I believe. and I'm speaking from lived experience there, as having had periods of my life where I experienced quite high levels of anxiety all the time. And when I started to approach it differently and started to work with the experience and start to breathe differently and just accept this is how I'm feeling now, and to think, okay, when I find myself now breathing in my chest and feeling that anxiety, I consciously start to breathe as deep into my belly as I can, to start to consciously slow the breath down, breathe in through my nose and elongate the breath out through my mouth. Often my body will calm as a result of that. And when it calms, what's going on up here begins to change as well. So how I make sense of the experience is completely different. And what I've learned is that actually, whereas say for 20 years, the question I would ask myself when I was struggling mentally was, what's wrong with me? What I now understand is that my nervous system doesn't necessarily know the difference between something that's happening right now and something that happened 20 years ago. So when that nervous system gets triggered, I'm going to feel anxiety. But if it's getting triggered because of something that happened to me a long time ago, making sense of it in the now in that way isn't necessarily going to give me the same relief. So this is just one example and one arena that we happen to have gone down when it comes to this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there are some fantastic pearls of wisdom. I think the rest of this conversation will help us paint the picture of your story, but also how you've gone from a place where you've maybe lacked the emotional self awareness, have gone away and done work around self curiosity, and now have come to a place where that's very much part and parcel of your daily and weekly routine. And now you're, I guess, as a person, I mean, maybe we can discuss how it is you're truly feeling as a person right now as a result of doing all of this work. But also at the end, I want to also make sure that we are coming back to some resources and things that people are able to leverage, that are able to get them started on that journey as well if they're interested in following that, to really go through that self-discovery and to make sure that they are really getting the most fulfillment and unlocking their true selves as they possibly can, because at the end of the day, that's what we should all be aspiring to do, to make sure that we're living our most fulfilled lives, right? But I wanted to kind of rewind and go back to your upbringing. It sounds like, you've not always been the person you are today, and as we all go through our journeys in life, and we grow, evolve, change, and you'll have different perspectives on the things that you truly believe in today. I want to kind of go back to where you came from, your upbringing, and then maybe some points along the way around your upbringing and through to your adult years where you can pinpoint and go, these are quite pivotal moments around who you have become as a person, and how it's set you onto the road that you have today.
Yeah, sure, no problem. I mean, I turn 50 next month, so I've been on the earth a while. It has been a bit of a journey, but I'd say that on the face of it, I had a very good and privileged upbringing, like two parents, second of four siblings. Um, my parents were teachers. I was brought up in a faith household, and I was taught by my dad at primary school. And I think those two things, being brought up in a faith household and being taught by my own father, had quite big impacts on me. And then the third thing that had a big impact on me growing up was that I was very talented at football. So I kind of, growing up and then coming to the attention of Tottenham Hotspur, and then being in the professional football system for the next 9 years, meant that with those three influences, I kind of learned a combination of things, some of which served me back then and continue to serve me today, but maybe some of them that didn't. So I'm just going to dig into that a little bit. So I think having faith is a really important thing for any of us, and I don't necessarily mean faith in God. It could be faith in ourselves, faith in the relationships that we have, faith in what we're doing with our lives. But I think when that is lacking, it can be really difficult to live with purpose and to enjoy the life that I really believe all of us deserve to have, which is a life of authenticity, exploration, growth. human connections. So I think growing up in a religious faith, but then losing that faith in adolescence had a really big impact on me. And I felt that difference. I felt like I'd lost something. Seeing my dad at school with a certain persona and seeing him at home with a different persona. So very jovial at work, like really well regarded, like charismatic teacher. And even though he could be all of those things as my father at home as well, he was often just knackered, short
Mm.
tempered, quite aloof. And I think what that taught me subconsciously was that we present our best selves at work and then we recover at home. And maybe it's our nearest and dearest that don't get to see the best side of ourselves enough of the time because of that. And then through football, what I learned was that high performance requires absolute dedication. It requires very little margin for error. It also taught me, without meaning to, this is what it means to be a man, and this is what it doesn't mean to be a man. And some of that was quite toxic. So when I came out of those kind of three institutions, if you like, family, football, and the church, into a young man going into university, I didn't have a clue who I was at all. I had no sense of self. And to plug that hole, to plug that gap, I looked for distraction, whether it was with alcohol or sex or films or anything else to really avoid, other than, to avoid actually sitting with myself and asking myself the kind of questions that I now support other people with and I've asked myself subsequently. So I went through that machine of getting my degree and starting a career in London and getting married. But then when the marriage went wrong, because I married somebody that simply because they asked me to, and I thought, well, it would be really rude of me to say no. It's so weird to like say that, but the people pleaser in me, that person that had learned to mold himself to whatever environment he was in, came through there. I didn't know this consciously at the time, but I think what that meant was that kind of my life as I got towards the end of my 20s just began to spiral out of control because there was no kind of core sense of self. There was no purpose. There was no real kind of guiding light coming from within. It was all just kind of going from one thing to the next and trying to have short-term experiences which would make life worth living at best and bearable at worst. So I think when I left London at the end of my 20s, I was in quite a dark place. I was very afraid of life and completely withdrew. I quit my job. I sold a house I was very privileged enough to have been afforded to buy, took all the money out of the bank and just hid for a while in weed and whatever I could find until I asked myself that first serious question, which was, I think I need help. And I'm glad that I answered that calling. And even though it's been 20 years since that point and where I am now, and it's been very much a journey of ups and downs, I think recognizing as a man that I need help and then actually having the courage to ask for it was the first step for me and the biggest.
And no, I appreciate you being so open about your journey. I think there's so much to dig into there because I think there's so many lessons to come from that. I want to kind of go back to, if I may, to the point where you were joining university as a young person, not really knowing what you wanted out of life and feeling slightly lost. I'll be honest, that is something that resonates with me highly because up to that point, my life had been very much centric to my sport as well, which was
Mm.
rugby. I think similar to you, I got to a very kind of, I got onto quite a fast stage when it comes to my rugby career before I was then released by Saracens when I was 18 years old. And all the while, I'd been in my head planning what my life was going to look like as a professional rugby player because I truly felt like that was what was meant for me. And then when the floor comes out from beneath you and you feel like you're now lost, I had some resentment towards the sport, even though I had opportunities to get back into it. It's not something I necessarily wanted to do straight away because I feel like I'd been stung after investing a lot of my life and myself into that sport and going into university then. I'd completely lost a sense of self because I felt like without rugby, what am I? I was sort of academic, but I was kind of getting by with a
Mm.
combination of relatively good academics, but also pretty good at rugby as well. So there's a combination of both. But I wouldn't say that I was an academic, and I guess I didn't afford myself to have too many interests outside that. So going into university, stepping out into the world as a man on your own for the first time with no real kind of grounding and basis as to who you are is an extremely scary thing. But also, I think we kid ourselves at the time as to thinking it's actually not that bad because you live, like you say, you've mentioned that there's an element of masking where you're going about day to day life with a people pleaser mentality. You're maybe going to parties, you're putting on the smile, the brave face. Um, so I think you're. Oh, there we go. Are we still good? We're still recording. Okay, sorry. Yeah, sorry. It just glitched out slightly. I'll pick up from where I was. But yes, so we're going about our life day to day, wearing a mask, not really knowing what's meant for us. If you kind of sit with that feeling as to how you were at that time in your life, can you think of the way that it felt and how you were maybe addressing some of those feelings and if you were at all, I guess.
Yeah, it's a great question. The truth of the matter is that those masks were a big part of gaining that short term approval. So a lot of those masks that I chose to wear at university were very, the lad, coming from the level of sport I'd come from, playing university sport with the university I was in was easy. So I was very successful, especially in that first year at university within football, and that gained a level of popularity. And then the more gregarious and outlandish my behaviour was, that seemed to get the approval of my peers, especially the male ones. So really, kind of drinking a lot, being great at sport, and having a lot of sex seemed to be what made got me approval. What I now know is that, but what I also had, by the way, when all that was going on, was moments of self reflection in my room where I was miserable, which no one ever saw, and there were tears. And there were frustrations, and there were all these emotions that I didn't know how to make sense of, or process, or sit with. Certainly didn't know how to talk to anyone about it. So it was this kind of duality of, this is how I'm presenting to my peers and out in the world, but inside I'm just tearing myself to bits. And that's such an uncomfortable place to be in. And I had no skills to be able to do that, that it just takes you back to the same behaviors that are making you feel that way. And you just get into a cycle that starts really slowly, that, as you said, feels okay to begin with. You don't really notice anything particularly awful. But when you've been doing that for a few years, the cycle gets quicker and quicker, and the benefits become less and less, and the pain grows and grows. And I think it just hits a tipping point. And I think that's a really strong narrative with a lot of men, especially men that I work with at some point in their life. They've had or they are currently having that experience.
Yeah, I think also during that time your inner critic is so loud because if these kind of actions and thoughts that are supposed to be filling the gap don't, but you're seeing that in other people, you're seeing that in men and people that are like you around you, and they're having a great time outwardly. They're smiling, they're always going out partying. People seem happy, but as we know and as we've explored, that not is not always the case on the inside. But your inner critic is becoming super loud because you're going, well, what the hell's wrong with you? You should be having a great time. You're having the time of your life. Let's and you're almost kidding yourself into believing it. And I think that can be one of the most dangerous things because what I think a lot of young men don't realize, especially, is that we're all going through quite a similar experience. But unfortunately, because there's not necessarily the vocab or the desire to want to have those deeper questions, and unfortunately, we get stuck into a bit of a adolescent superficiality about life at that time, then we can become stuck. And like you said, it only becomes after a while, and with the benefit of hindsight, and after you've been kind of stung by that cycle a few times, that you only then kind of sit with yourself and go, okay, maybe I need to reflect my behaviour and what actually truly is going on right now.
Yeah, I think actually as well, there's something as you were speaking then and talking about that that experience as a young man. There's something about feeling safe that came up for me, where it's actually that there just weren't any spaces I felt safe to start to open up about what was really going on in me. You know, a word again coming to mind as I'm explaining that is kind of banter, male humour, camaraderie, all of those things which can have a really positive impact. But I think if you are in a place where you are searching for the safety to be able to start to open up to somebody, those places aren't always easy to find, and they were almost impossible for me to find as a young man. I hope things have moved on a lot, and I have hope that they have, but I still think it's a problem that exists everywhere in our society.
Yeah, and I think that's something that we'll come on to a bit later. But I think you're absolutely right, and um, I do feel like gradually it is getting better. I think the tools are becoming more available, and it's becoming more of a widespread. Okay, let's have a conversation about this. Let's actually check in. But at the same time, especially having a younger brother who's going through that point of his life right now, I also know from personal experience that there are sufficient challenges in that, and we'll explore those as we go on. But I wanted to kind of understand for you how it felt to let go of some of those feelings of, so you've overcome the people pleasing aspect of your life, where that was to dominate your thought processes and how you felt in terms of a self-worth point of view, and in doing so, I think it would have released some of those behaviours, those activities, and potentially interests that you were so invested in at the time. Upon reflection, how did it feel initially, but then also long term, how does it feel to kind of relinquish control? I guess the people pleasing aspect of you had.
So the best way I can describe it, James, is to say that it wasn't when the question that inner critic was asking or shouting at me more like, what's wrong with me? When that question through therapeutic help began to become not what's wrong with me, but what are the things that happened to me, or what are the experiences that I had, and how did that go on to impact who I became then? When I shone a light on that and became curious about that, I began to realize that I know we have that high level sporting um, in common, that part of our journey where we thought our life was going to be one thing, but then it wasn't. So experiencing 3 or 4 rejections within 3 or 4 years of being told we want you and then you're not good enough. That phrase, you're not good enough, was what sat behind that critical voice. You are not good enough. You're not good enough to be you, was what no one told me that. No football coach said that to me, but that was the message I took from those experiences. So people pleasing for me is a set of behaviors that are actually more common than you might think. But generally, when there's low self worth for whatever reason, you're going to become what you think people need you to be for that self worth to rise. And again, it kind of does. It works for a while, but then you end up with that same dilemma of feeling a disconnect between how you're behaving out there and in here. And you get to that point of these short term gains just aren't working for me anymore because they're getting shorter and shorter and the pain's growing and growing. So I think that realizing that having a different curiosity about my life story and being able to look at it differently and feel differently about it. So now when I look back on my experiences within football, I realized that I did the best that I could with what I knew and who I was at the time. And actually, I had so many successes during that period, and it's taught me so much that I now lead with in my current life, professionally and personally, that I'm really grateful for those rejections because they have made me who I am now. But the process isn't really about recovery by becoming somebody new with all of these learnings. It's about actually peeling away those layers of conditioning and hurt and masking to actually reveal what was already there in the first place. That's the best way I can describe it.
Yeah, and it's a beautiful message. I think, and I've had conversations really recently with people who I think feel less than because that is their inner critic talking, and that they're worried about their impact of actions or lack of action on how people perceive them. And what actually you need to, I think we all need to do to a certain degree a little bit more is come home to ourselves by peeling the layers back, like you said, really truly understanding ourselves, learning to appreciate what as a person that we bring to the table, but at the end of the day, what is going to make us truly happy and fulfilled, and take away some of this noise. But of course, it's difficult to do that unless we know how. So I kind of wanted to then fast forward us then to the point where you actually recognised, okay, I do need some help. And that came, I think you mentioned at a point in your early 30s. I wanted to just explore how that manifested in terms of how you recognized in the moment that you did feel like you needed help. And then what was your kind of first kind of step on that journey to getting help?
Well, the first, picking up from where I left off with that part of the story, like having completely effectively disengaged from life in any meaningful way and sitting with a pile of cash at home and spending a lot of that on weed and doing not very much, trying to maintain what wellness I could in that environment. Ultimately, I wasn't earning any money. Money was going down. It was at the point when I realized this is going to run out really soon if I don't do something. And it was just a kind of a punt out of the blue to just say, I'm going to book a session with a therapist and see what happens. And actually, I didn't really speak for about 4 or 5 sessions. It was a person centered counselor. So, for those of you that may not be aware, person centered is very kind of client led. So, the therapist does a lot of active listening, reflecting back what they're hearing. But it's all about trying to empower the person in therapy to find their own answers and solutions to whatever struggles they're facing. This was the first time I'd ever sat in a room where I was being invited to open up, and I didn't feel safe. I didn't feel safe to. I could have easily binned it off after a session or two and thought, well, why am I paying this money to sit in a room and not say anything? And I think after 4 or 5 sessions when I'd been very monosyllabic, not really opened up at all, and my therapist just asked a question and said, do you mind if I ask you a question? And they said, and I said, no, it's fine. And they said, I'm just curious whether you're paying for this or someone else is. And I literally exploded and I went, for fuck's sake, like really loud, just absolutely like, because it felt like what that was triggering in me was this judgment of like not being seen for me, but actually it was a very clever question which got me to emotionally open up. And from then I just started to speak. And that was probably the first time I ever had spoken my truth for 40 minutes nonstop after that, just letting it all out and crying and just in no way, shape or form that made any sense. But it was everything at that moment. It was like
Wow.
a
Oh,
release.
wow. Yeah. Yeah, I was going to say, how did that feel?
I left that session feeling about 5 stone lighter. I just felt like that was really powerful. And I think from that point onwards, as I said, even though there's been so many ups and downs in my life since, just that kind of hope of, wow, there's something going on here that feels new and hopeful, has never really left me, I think.
That's awesome. I think that's a really good insight as to someone that has been brought up in a very traditional way, who's not been exposed to that way of thinking, and that would have taken an immense amount of bravery and courage to seek out that help. And then once you did take the leap, once you did show that bravery and courage, and was asked that question that finally allowed you to open up, the fact that you felt that immense weight lifted off you, I think that's just a testament to show that that there is resource out there, despite, regardless of how you were brought up, regardless of who you are, is that when you find something that resonates with you to allow you to yourself to open up and become more vulnerable,
Mm.
then immense weights can be lifted from your chest. Or however the weight gets lifted off. But I think that's a really, I wanted to really pinpoint
Mm.
that point, because I know that that's something that still so many men, especially, but people in general, struggle with on a day to day basis. And despite what we do hear in society, social media about mental health and all these fantastic organisations doing a great thing, and we see a lot of more of a positive movement, I still think there's an immense struggle there. And I think actually you sharing your personal story and insight is going to really resonate with a lot of people who may have gone through something similar. So I wanted to thank you for that. And yeah, thank you for sharing so vulnerably. I wanted to kind of then take us on to that point in your life where you're then exploring then and I might be paraphrasing and your journey, so please feel free to correct me. But we then go from that point where you've had the first therapy session, you begin to open up. You are now an emotional agility coach.
Mm.
How does that happen?
Very imperfectly and messily. But no, I think like what that first period, I ended up staying with that therapist for about a year. I'd left London, as I said, I'd kind of gone back to the family home and had like closed myself off. This opened myself up again to believe that I could step out into the world and do it in a way that was meaningful to me. So over the next sort of dozen or so years until I hit my 40s, I moved city. I explored music, which was something that I'd always been into just as much as football, but had rejected as in primary school because it for that same kind of football got me kind of liked and accolades and that kind of thing. Music that didn't feel very kind of male in the environments I grew up with, so I kind of rejected that. So I explored that. That brought me to Nottingham. I then embarked on a corporate management career, which got me interested in working with people and teams. But I struggled. I did struggle because what therapy had given me was a self belief to go back into the world. But what that kind of therapy didn't give me was the tools to be able to thrive in it. So over a period of time, a lot of those old behaviours like the people pleasing, the emotional outbursts would start to come back in. So I think ultimately it took a further breakdown probably when I was 38, something like that, about 12 years ago, where things just got too much. Again, a relationship ended. I'd bought a house 4 months before the financial crisis in 2008. So I was in negative equity, trying to pay for a house I couldn't really afford or move out from. I was in a really high pressured work situation I wasn't thriving in, and I just things got too much for me again. And I think that rather than let things get to the state they got to before, I'd learned from those experiences and I immediately sought help. I was off sick from work for a while, but then I opened myself up to different things, to different kinds of therapies. And over the next 12 years, I think I've continued to steadily widen my palette personally, first and foremost, to get to a point where I understood that I'm not just what I think, and sometimes what I think isn't real. I am just as much what I think, what I feel. And I think it was that retuning into why am I emotionally outbursting? What is it about me and how I feel about my life that's making me choose the behaviors I'm choosing? And just got really curious about it, and increasingly so. When I worked for Eon's engineering consultancy for about 9 years, during which this period happened. And in 2017, the role I had was made redundant. And at that stage, I thought this is going to be the impetus for me to really kick on now. That was 2017. So I used some of that redundancy money to do the counselling qualifications and to start to think about where my career was going to go for the rest of my life. And then, of course, 2020, the pandemic happened, by which time I'd met my partner, Jess. And that was a real pivotal moment because it was such a collective experience really challenging, really difficult for everybody in some way, shape, or form. And I think that with it felt to me like coming out of that, this was the time to really step into my power and be of service, because the world will never be the same again. And I don't think it is. And I think we're still learning what a post-pandemic world is going to be. But it was really that decision, sorry, that occurrence that made me make the decision in conjunction with my partner Jess to really take a leap of faith that I think I can be a really good coach. I think I've got something to offer through all my life experiences, and I want to continue to train in different modalities so that I have a wide range of tools available, so that when I work with somebody, I can meet them where they are, wherever that might be, and they can choose what works for them and what they're going to carry forward with them. So I hope that makes sense as a transition.
Yeah, absolutely, and we've discussed already, I guess, how it was the feeling that you had after the work that you've done around self discovery that then led you to that eventual decision to make the leap and then become the coach that you are today. You mentioned exploring different types of therapy, and I think again, I do feel like there is a stigma against a lot of different forms of therapy that seem quite alien to people, that I think some people in layman's terms would maybe say are a little bit kumbaya, and potentially see that as scary, or they'd see that as something, they dismiss it as something that's not going to work for them off the bat, but for no particular reason other than the stigma that exists within society. What would you say to those people who kind of hold a stigma, or have reservations about exploring different types of therapy, and in order to overcome them, and then how curiosity in that way has served you?
So the first thing I would say is that if you undertake the most cursory of Google searches about the subconscious mind and the unconscious mind that we all have, those things that are happening outside our awareness, they're effectively the programs within us that when we get to adulthood largely run themselves. So estimates from scientific studies, and again, the cursory Google search will show you this, about 95% of the thoughts that go through our head that drive the way we behave, about 95% of them are recurring. There's only sort of this 5% of inspiration or creativity on average. And 80% of those can be quite negative, which harks back to kind of our cave people days of literally fearing for our life. So that negative bias is an inbuilt part of our collective history. So I think for me, if you think about change and growth and aspirations and dreams, it's very difficult to change when everything's running on autopilot. And if the way things are running on autopilot aren't necessarily making us feel good about ourselves, it makes that journey feel like, oh, I don't think I'm going to benefit from this. That's just one of the programs. So some of the modalities that I became really curious to experience and then are now trained in involve working with our kind of subconscious and our unconscious mind. So a couple of examples could be neuro-linguistic programming, which encourages people to go inwards and to work with their experiences in different ways. Could it be imagery or sounds or whatever's going on within them? Hypnotherapy is a more common one people have heard of, which is working with somebody that's willing to try and get them into a deep sense of relaxation so that their brain waves will change to that kind of dreamlike theta state where you can potentially work with some of those programs and begin to rewire them. But then also those more kind of active practices like breath work. So conscious connected breath work, for example, is a real favorite of mine because it takes you out of your conscious thinking mind. You kind of go quiet and you can have some very transformational emotional experiences. So I think without curiosity, I think I think um, I think being tentative, dipping a toe in is fine. Look after yourself. Be safe as you do it. I always say to people when they're trying something new, keep one foot in safety, but maybe dip the toe in. Just try it. Be curious. but tune into that open-mindedness of what do you actually experience. And if it works for you, try it again. And if it doesn't, that's okay.
Yeah, I think it's a great message. And one thing that I would say from personal experience is that I historically would have had reservations about that, especially as a younger man. Um, but one of the most impactful moments that I can remember, especially in recent times, but probably of my life, was the first breathwork session that I ever did, which, funnily enough, Nick, you orchestrated and led when we were on the weekend away with Encourage, which was an incredible weekend. But I never knew that that kind of thing existed. And until I experienced it, I never knew how impactful it could be. And breathwork is now something that I practice, not as often as I should, but definitely working on it. But I think it's just, and I also want to put across how wonderful it is to explore and be curious in that way. It's a wonderful journey because you're learning more about yourself, but also it can be fun to go to those places. Don't get me wrong, it can be very challenging because there are some parts of us that are locked up. There can be traumas, that can be experiences that we don't necessarily want to revisit, but it's really important to in order to move on with our lives and also learn something that's very important. But it can also be a really fun process because you are unlocking parts of yourself that is going to only lead to this enhanced experience of life. And I think it's just so important that we, as people, try and explore as much of those as possible. And that leads me on to kind of my last kind of couple of questions, and it's more holistically around where we are as a society. We kind of just touched on it briefly then, but just in your opinion, where do you think our biggest blockers are at the moment when it comes to men in particular? Because that is what we can speak to from our experience around opening up, being more vulnerable with each other, and just in general.
Okay. I think for me, I think the biggest blocker at the moment is that we understand mental health and well-being purely from an individual basis, it seems. So when we think of, or again, without wanting to generalize too much, but when we think of mental health and we think of people struggling, say, with anxiety or depression, these are clinically, through that clinical lens, it's effectively individualizing the problem. And I think that for me, widening the lens to say, as we've touched on in this conversation already, and say, as men, none of us really have grown up in a way that allows us to develop those sides of ourselves, like our emotional intelligence, like our sensitivity, like our creativity, in the same way that maybe other traits are encouraged. And if we think about some of the common sayings that we say to young boys, like, big boys don't cry, for example, these things I believe do have an effect. But I think these things exist in society, in community, in family, friendships, as well as individually. So I think for me, one of the biggest blockers is the shame you feel as an individual when you're struggling because of all these things I've mentioned. If we become curious and brave enough to say, actually, being a human being, arguably, as wonderful and as amazing as it can be, is going to come with struggle at some stage. If we normalize the fact that we're not always going to be at our best, we're going to have times where we flourish, but we're also going to have times where we struggle. And sometimes that happens because of things we have control over as an individual, but sometimes it doesn't. So I think it's really trying to break down those barriers to create spaces where we feel safe enough to say, actually, yeah, I know what it feels like to feel anxious, and I know what it feels like to doubt myself, and I know what it feels like to have a loud inner critical voice telling me I'm not good enough. And if we normalize that, what I've noticed, especially in the past 4 or 5 years, as I've been doing this work and going into these spaces like where we met, for the first time, when men feel safe enough, that collective togetherness you can feel in such a short space of time, I think is so powerful. And it tells me that this isn't an individual problem. This is a collective issue, which the more we shine a light on and accept, the more progress, I think, will be made. And look, at the other end of the spectrum, to be perfectly blunt, I think the less suicides in males we'll see. So I think it's a collective responsibility to individually, but as a society and everything that sits in between those 2 points, try and do our bit, whatever that might be.
And what are, in your experience, some of the most powerful examples that you've seen that in practice?
Of what? Sorry. Of
So,
what?
in terms of creating those spaces, in
Mm.
terms of taking that responsibility to destigmatize and and make sure that we are promoting those healthier behaviours around mental well-being, do you have to mind some of the most powerful practices or examples in of that working and progress being made?
Yeah, absolutely. I personally see kind of all sorts and manners of community interest companies opening up that have an interest in well-being generally, but men's well-being specifically, Encourage being one of them, which is incredible what they do. There's a number of them locally that I've explored, and I think that the fact that these things are now coming, these spaces are growing. There are more of them. They're more accessible. They're getting bigger, tells me that collectively there are enough people at the moment starting to lead with this realization that when we create spaces for men to step into that are accessible and where they feel safe, they will open up and they will hold space for other men to do the same. And then you go away from those spaces back into your families, your friendships, your life. And hopefully you can begin to then experience those things and those environments in a different way, and maybe start to realize where some of those environments have some toxic behaviors or behaviors that don't lend themselves to what I've just said. And you get to make a decision whether you want to have an impact in those spaces, maybe in a small way to begin with, or maybe you realize actually maybe these spaces no longer serve me because the culture isn't willing to change. So I work one to one with people, James, and I work in some of these kind of spaces I've just spoken about. But I'm also going into schools and organisations where, in their own way, you know, we talk about having to wear a professional mask, and I think that's important. We can't just show up, completely openly and vulnerably in whatever environment we're in. But there's a big difference between showing up authentically and wearing a mask of professionalism in the way we dress, the way we speak, the way we treat each other. There's a difference between that and completely losing who we are to have to wear a mask to survive in those work environments. So I think to be honest, I'm seeing it everywhere, but I'm also seeing in all of those examples places where that safety doesn't exist and it isn't embraced. So there's still a lot more to do.
And I know that you are one of the people that is flying the banner most high with all the work that you do. And I guess on that, I wanted to, before I give you a chance to share all of the wonderful things that you're doing, I wanted to just take the time to say thank you for coming onto the podcast, sharing your story so openly and vulnerably. You are a fantastic human being, making so much difference to so many people's lives. No doubt that someone somewhere will hear this and be impacted by your story and hopefully moved in a positive way towards exploring their own emotional agility and actually understanding themselves a little bit more to unlock to a new heights the different life that they can feel and experience as a result of that and go exploring, I think, at the end of the day. But I wanted to thank you for everything you shared. I've truly enjoyed, like I do all our conversations in all honesty, but I really have enjoyed this. And on that, I wanted to kind of just pass it across to you and give you an opportunity to share everything that you have going on in your life in terms of where people can find you, and anything that you'd like to share.
James, look, thanks. It's been an absolute pleasure. As you said, talking on this new venture of yours, this amazing podcast that you've created, or whether we're just chatting or the way we've worked together, like it's a privilege to know you too, mate. So thank you very much. And this conversation has been really rich and beautiful and imperfect and messy, but hopefully offers value to anyone that will be listening. I think for me, the business that I run with my Jess is the 3E space. So literally the number three and the letter E. That stands for explore, energize, and empower, which is effectively the three-stage process to whatever we do. Um, I do work one-to-one with people over a sort of 4 to 6 month period. I also do short-term individual sessions. I have my own men's group monthly called the Sunday Space. I collaborate with other men's groups like Encourage and Help Facilitate. You can find me on BBC Midlands Radio most weeks on the Circle of Men show. I'm speaking at Festival, an online mental wellness festival, in a couple of weeks' time. And I work with organisations and teams. So really, just to kind of humanise that experience, I find that productivity and wellness aren't mutually exclusive. I think success can be had on both of those by humanising what we do. So just connect with me at the 3E space. I hang out mostly on Instagram. Nick Edgar Coaching is my personal page. Just connect, say hello, let's start a
I
conversation.
will share the links to everything you've just mentioned in the description on Spotify and YouTube. We'll see if we make YouTube yet. I'm still exploring with YouTube, but yeah, Nick, thank you so much for coming on. If I can ask you as a listener to follow on Spotify so you don't miss any of the episodes that we've got coming up, and also you can find any extra content and clips of this conversation on at Can I Be Open on Instagram. And yeah, your support would be very much appreciated. But I do hope that you've all enjoyed this really beautiful conversation that I've had with my good friend Nick, and I hope to see you all again very soon.